welcome to the second edition of Desultory Philosophy, a conversation that I had with Razwan Faraz. I think you'll agree it's a fascinating conversation. We explored subjects such as Islam, the representation of Islam in the West, and what Islam might have to offer the Western liberal world. Razwan was an extremely engaging guest, and I think it sparks a good deal of conversations for the future on how Islam and other spiritual traditions might find common ground to solutions that we have in the Western world. Okay, I'm going to hand you over to Razwan now. He's someone that I met at a global peace conference in Muğla in Turkey, and I was fascinated to hear Raz speak on the bus, especially when we were in kind of downtime on this conference, and he really struck me as someone who seemed to be speaking a kind of fresh and exciting kind of message from Islam that I'd not heard before. So I'm going to hand you over to Raz for a brief bio.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Luke. So my background is I'm a father of 3 young boys. I say young, my eldest is 19, youngest is 10. And, I'm a Muslim, born Muslim, Muslim by choice as well. And in terms of career-wise, I was a teacher. And now, I work in charity. I work with volunteers, develop them, create opportunities for volunteers to make a difference in various areas, from fundraising all the way to advocacy work and campaigning and doing some sort of philanthropy work abroad. Even that's what I am.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Raz. I suppose the reason why I was interested to do this podcast was that I grew up not far from you, actually, in a very multicultural part of South Birmingham.
Yeah.
I went to a school that was 90% Pakistani, Kashmiri, Afghani kids. So I had a very positive experience with that. A lot of my friends when I was younger were Muslim kids, and I'd be invited to their families' houses to eat, and it was always, I had a real fondness for that kind of culture. And then it almost coincided with me becoming an adult, and I was going through my own kind of stuff at the time anyway, and things were changing. But so at the age of 21, 2001 was probably the kind of monumental moment in the kind of global psyche, where Islam was kind of wielded out as the kind of baddie on the global picture. Now, what I wanted to explore was my kind of personal reconciliation between what I knew as a child and kind of growing up with this new kind of vision of Islam that we might see today, and to kind of how do you see what are the kind of factors that have gone into play in order to kind of change this perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for many of us, including myself, 9/11 was pivotal. It was such a worldwide. There's nobody in the world who won't have heard of what happened at 9/11, and in many ways impacted by it. Whether it's directly or indirectly. So even myself, although at the time I also was 21, and as a young man, I didn't really have a way of seeing myself as a part of the world that I was living in. And in terms of in the beginning, when I certainly kind of observed what happened, it led me really to deepen my connection with what I thought Islam was at the time. And I think for many people, that's what it probably did. It was a deciding point. I mean, we even had the president of the United States saying, "You're either with us or you're against us." And as much as many questioned him on that, I think that did leave, much of the remnants of that psyche was left on many of us, that actually you've got the most powerful man in the world saying, "You're either with me or against me," and with me in going and, bombing, or with me and going and eradicating what? Because he was using terminology like, this is a crusade, which kind of triggered many Muslims to think, well, actually, is this going to be, another part of the Christian crusade against Islam, against Muslims, and all of this kind of thing. And I think it did divide for a long time. Certainly even in the individual, myself, I was certainly divided. And at the time, where I found most security was in the lap of individuals who were giving me more clarity, and that clarity was, we hate the West, and we need to defend Islam. That was the space that I found security at the time, and it was a space that I, few years later, left, and realized how shallow that world was and how fragile it was. But nonetheless, it was a space that gave me safety, and I think many people felt probably the same on either side of the aisle. That these Muslims that, in your case, that you may have grown up with, are they harboring secret views to kill me? And you can't. It's a difficult set of questions to navigate through. But I'm hoping today, even if there's many years later, I think we can really kind of drill down to some of those things.
Okay, yeah. Another, I suppose, I think especially in Birmingham and kind of the industrial north of the country, that's been another kind of facet of what people see as perhaps problematic with Islam, is the kind of instances of sexual exploitation that have happened, typified by Rotherham, and we do tend to see, and here's another point really, it's what we see, and it's what's given us by the media, and I understand that, but there's you tend to get the mugshots of quite clearly. Let's say Pakistani men or men from from the Indian subcontinent, and I was just wondering, is that anything to do with Islam, or is that more to do with a culture within Pakistan, or a kind of within tribes, a tribal element within Pakistan, or a cultural element?
I'd like to kind of reframe the question, but certainly, still at the same time answer the question that is there anything within certain denominations of Islam that encourage such activities?
Yes.
Because I think that's a question that any individual who has any influence within the Muslim community should be asking. Is that, does any of our rhetoric, does any of our practices, does any of our spaces subconsciously or inadvertently encourage the sexual exploitation, or does it encourage any action that's on a trajectory that leads to such exploitation? In the first thing, I mean, it's very important. I categorically, such actions are against Islam, and there's not a single Muslim who will in terms, if you ask them, is this allowed in Islam? There's no denomination that will say yes, it is allowed. It's not allowed in any shape. In the first instance, sex outside of marriage is discouraged. The act of sex is not absent of the giving of the self, and hence sex and the soul are together, and usually within a marital space is when it's where it's essentially encouraged. And anything outside of that, then it's seen as a sin. It's seen as incorrect. But what I don't want to kind of equate somebody committing an act of sex outside of marriage to somebody exploiting a youngster. They're not the same thing. There's a whole heap of different things that play into that, and I myself work with a number of young men, and I tackle these issues. I recently ran like a workshop where I asked the question, how what is the Pakistani community doing enough to tackle the child abuse? And there's the way I guess I would respond to that is there's accountability and then there's responsibility. So largely I would say that the Pakistani culture doesn't necessarily promote this kind of thing directly, but indirectly there are issues, and even some of the leanings of the Islamic faith, there are patriarchal kind of practices. So when you've got institutions, fundamental central institutions like the mosque, which don't have women on the board, or don't have equal spaces given to women to come and congregate within the mosque, they're usually given a space right at the back, and it's usually, or if it's there at all. And it's changing, don't get me wrong, but we're here to talk about the ugliness. I'm not here as a Muslim to paint a brilliant picture. It's about truth. And so what I'd say is that the fact that in the first instance, I think that there are certain conservative versions of Islam that are patriarchal, and what began as a patriarchal protection of society, especially coming into the West with a migrant mentality, there's an element of we have to protect our identity, and one of the best ways to protect yourself is, as in what was thought at the time, was through patriarchy. It's the man is the one who protects, and the woman is the one who has to be protected in that sense. So what that then means is that there's that power differential, and I think that largely influences how a woman is seen, right? Now, I think that psyche of seeing a woman as the victim you're protecting does then, when there is a woman or a young girl who is in a vulnerable situation, I think that young girl can be exploited by such an individual who doesn't see a woman in the first instance as an equal. That's what I would argue, that anybody who doesn't see a woman as an equal will no doubt be playing on that power trip, because it's like, by virtue of your inferiority to me, this individual will think. By virtue of your inferiority to me, this individual feels empowered themselves. So when you have now, whether it's social policies or whether it's post-colonial mindset of, being a community that largely is being maligned, when you have that disempowered state, what happens then is it goes on overdrive, which is right. The disempowerment in that patriarchal mindset then finds a victim. It's that sadism is kind of
it literally flips around.
That's right. That's right. It's like, where are the victims? And it's victims within their own household, and it's just the I'll put up a post recently that, don't think that the man around you who is looking at women in a sexual way, essentially that he isn't looking at your sisters in the same way. That the fact that he doesn't do it to your sisters doesn't mean he isn't doing it when you're away, and that women need to be seen in an equal way to us, regardless of whether she's related to you or not. And that's the starting point, that we need to kind of get back to that stage. And my own thoughts are that there is an element of a post-colonial mindset that is still there, of feeling the inferiority. There is a migrant mindset that also has seeped in. Don't get me wrong, I'm not entirely generalizing, but I'm saying that there's a huge fusion of different thoughts and ideas that I think have come together that have led to many of these wrongdoings. When you're new and plus, economically, there's issues of trying to find your space, and with all of that, the criminal world becomes more accessible than a system that isn't built to make you flourish in that sense. So I think in terms of from an Islamic point of view, there isn't a categorical condoning of any of this. It doesn't. But the application of it in certain
post-colonial settings,
certain denominations of the Islamic faith that are still, I guess, even unashamedly patriarchal, I think they lend themselves, particularly a very strong extremist, conservative, very, very conservative type of rendering of Islam does lend itself to thinking that because the man is the most important place in the household. I mean, they even purport ideas of if after God a woman was to bow down to anyone, it would be her husband. I mean, these kind of nonsensical ideas.
Is that in the Quran or the Hadith?
No. I mean, it's not in the Quran at all because in the Quran there's many examples of how the man and woman are equal. We're all equal in that sense. But in terms of this certain, I guess, hadith that do lend themselves to getting exploited, but nevertheless, the question is, where do they actually even come from? Because to me, anything that suggests that one individual should bow down to another, in this case, suggesting that a woman her piety is seen in how she serves her husband, right? That for me is against the true spirit of Islam, which is that we only bow down to God. Like you can't reconcile the two. And so I've spent a large part of the last 10 odd years, or a little bit more than that, questioning myself and questioning those around myself, on some of these really unusual ideas that I see now, but at the time were normal. To think that actually a woman should bow down to a man, if after God that the man is given that much regard and esteem, it's problematic. And I think those kind of ideas do seep into when an individual is disempowered, is disconnected, doesn't have. And this is the other thing, is that when we came from back home, there was a much more community. And with the overdrive of, I guess, capitalism, which has broken down the family unit, whatever ideal family unit you have, I don't just mean in terms of the 2.4 children, mother, father. I'm meaning wider family, because if somebody gets divorced, doesn't mean that they're broken. Do you see what I'm saying? It just means that you've got divorced. But what tends to happen is certain families, they're isolated from their wider relatives, or we don't know our neighbors, and all of these kind of factors mean that actually the connection between human to human is lost. So when the connection is gone, then the sense of if I hurt you, I'm hurting myself gets lost. And it's like I'm hurting you to make myself feel a little bit better, like it's because you're the victim. And I think there is that sadistic mindset has crept into to some of these fractions of the Islamic faith.
Okay, so the solution to that is that essentially a spiritual solution? Is that a kind of because we were talking before, I've had my own kind of spiritual journey, and I've had my own kind of at times fractious kind of understanding of that, and I've come to kind of see the solution to my own personal kind of problems as a spiritual one. Essentially, it begins with my own kind of internal, for me, meditation, and then of course action based upon that. So it's not just a purely selfish thing. So on a kind of community level, also, would you see that a more of an application towards a more perhaps spiritual, mystical element of Islam may be the kind of solution to this more? Because it sounds to me what you're saying is when you put this faith which is essentially about love and about kind of humanity and equality to all people. If you put it in a certain setting, which is post-colonial, immigrant, aggressive capitalism, that it then pathologizes it. It then becomes problematic.
Yeah.
So is the solution therefore to get back to a more spiritual?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely. I mean, that's certainly been my own journey. When I grew up in a predominantly Muslim area, predominantly Pakistani school, and I certainly felt lost. My parents were working all the time. I felt lost, and then growing up and kind of finding myself in circles that are very dangerous, whether it was in the first instance a gang culture, and in the second instance an extremist culture, which it would have been very, very was life-threatening for me at some point. But what happened is there was a point where I kind of had to face myself, and in facing myself, I realized that, hang on a second, I'm using these frameworks to capture who I am, and that framework was religion. And I think that when we're resonating at a very low frequency, we tend to kind of hold on to whether it's material goods, to have the best dressed individual or have the most fancy car or have the biggest home, and that's, for me, is exactly the same as a person who uses religion as their crutch. And what I mean by that is, by virtue of I've got to turn up to the church, or I've got to turn up to the mosque, and I've got to wear the particular attire, and I've got to be using the lingo that makes me acceptable within this particular environment. And yet the same individual, you'll see time and time again across all faiths, but we're talking about Islam here right now, is that the same individual will be caught visiting a prostitute, or the same individual will be caught trying to meet up with a minor, and this is supposed to be some sort of religious leader, right? And why is that? And I think that it's because the collective consciousness, not just within Muslim community, but I think the wider community, just anybody, the collective consciousness is a materialistic one. It's like we see each other, something we were mentioning earlier on, transactional. And I think it's kind of moving away from that. And where the true message of Islam for me is that it's the message of oneness. Because we, when we're children, we're a wholesome upbringing is one that celebrates who we are in our entirety, and one that trusts that there's something innate within every single one of us to find our way and actualize our self. But what happens along the line, whether it's neglect or abuse or trauma or whatever it may be, there's a whole multiple reasons that causes us to kind of disconnect with ourselves and place these masks on us. And those masks could be religion, a version of religion. That mask could be work. That mask could be your health. It is, in terms of going to the gym and trying to look in a certain way, that is a mask. So I think the spiritual solution is the one to return to the realization of the oneness of the self, because what Islam I was talking about this to my son yesterday, that the essence of the Islamic faith is you enter into it by uttering the words La ilaha illallah, and it's, for years, every single day, several times a day, I've been saying this. It's like the basis, right? But I'm 38 this year. I've turned 38, and I would say that it's only this year that I've really truly understood what it means. Because what it means, the literal meaning is La, there is no, Illah, there is no God, Illallah, except God. That's like the literal meaning. But what's interesting is, I reflected on why is it that this kind of declaration of faith begins with negation. Like, surely a faith that expresses itself as love, as unity, as growth, as should begin with positivity. And yet the very essence of the declaration of the Islamic faith is, first you must reject. And I thought, what am I rejecting? And it it's very clear you're rejecting gods, but I don't worship any other god. But then that got me thinking, what does it mean by God? Because surely anything that we are submissive to, essentially we've become a slave to. And that's when I realized, hang on a second. If I am triggered by anything from my past, or if I'm triggered by certain experiences historically that have influenced me, whether it's colonialism, whether it's kind of the ones that we mentioned, whatever those are, that actually if I feel inferior to any of that, or if I feel inferior to any individual, or if I feel inferior to anything that's happened from my past, then I've essentially become a slave to it. And the utterance of La ilaha is a rejection, saying, no, that's not your God. Don't submit to any of that. And then the latter part is illallah, to say that accept Allah. But then this is the interesting thing. None of us have met God. None of us have met the divine, this energy, whatever it is. And this notion of this man sitting on this throne is not God. I don't believe that by any stretch. I think the energy of God, and I sometimes don't even use the word God, if I'm honest, because I think it just has so many connotations of this being that isn't running through you and me. Now the interesting thing is that the divine is without definition, but none of us can define it. So what can we understand though is the self. So the illallah bit of Islam is actually, there is nothing in the past except the oneness of myself. Because when we reach the oneness of ourselves, that's when we're closest to that divine energy. And that's essentially what the message of Islam is. It's taking us in that cyclical way of saying, La, there's nothing like all of that is gone. It's not you. You're not submissive to anything, and that you are important enough to be the king of your kingship, to be the king of your kingdom. And that king is only then a slave to the true king, which is the divine.
Yeah. I think I really like that, and I think it's something that it's that kind of practical, spiritual. The way that you've put that is something that I think that the majority of people will have never have thought about Islam. That there is that at its foundation there is such a strong declaration about the spiritual well-being of all humanity. It's certainly something that I kind of follow a Buddhist path, really, but there's something very similar really in Buddhism, to be honest with you, which is it's not surrender as such, perhaps, although in a way it could be seen in that way, and I kind of do in a way, really. But it is that, all of the past, all of this, all of the suffering that we see around us, and how it's actually how our thoughts engage with that, and we create our own suffering, and it's our kind of our thought process that does that. This idea that don't get entangled in that isn't your drive, your goal. I really do like what's been said there. And I'd never heard that before. I think quite often you just, as you do with Buddhist chanting, actually, and I grew up with the call to prayer, all around me, and in Borsall Heath and Sparkhill, and it just becomes, it sounds very beautiful. I mean, it really is a very beautiful thing, but it's almost, for me, it kind of represents a kind of metaphor for how faith kind of has gone, really. Just some kind of arcane chanting that sounds quite nice. Do most people even think about what's being said there, the core?
And it's the so for me, every morning I'll have my meditation cycle, and it begins with this, which is the La ilaha illallah, which is, and whenever I feel disempowered, it's I chant this is an incantation in the sense of, if I'm feeling a little bit inferior, if I'm feeling broken, if I'm feeling a little bit, upset by something that's happened, it's the realization that what I've done is I've imagined something to be more powerful than me. Because everything is that. How I see you, how we see each other is actually, it's entirely our perception. It's not the reality ever. But we treat it like it's the reality, and we then behave in that way. And I guess the beauty, and one of the reasons why when, for example, the Hajj, the pilgrimage occurs, that everybody does this pilgrimage, this one moment in the year when all Muslims, like, it's just unheard of for it to happen. Although there's minor pilgrimages that happen, but in terms of this, like, inviting everybody to come, they come dressed the same as a symbol to say that there is no hierarchy between you. And that message, unfortunately, I would say that although not exclusively to Muslims, has been lost. It's been lost because, me having grown up in a very traditional, conservative upbringing, the depth of my Islam was measured in the length of my beard. The quality of my Islam was measured in the attire that I donned, and it was never this thing of, well, actually, how you look is irrelevant. And it reminds me of an example where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that there was and he was describing the journey of the self, that there was this woman who was a prostitute, and she was either she was going home or she was going somewhere, and along her way she saw a dog that was thirsty, and it was panting, and it was about to die. And so she climbed down this well and she took the shoe, she filled the shoe up with water, and she got up, and she helped quench the thirst of this dog. And he said that she's a woman of paradise. And it kind of really does disrupt this notion of what is a person of paradise. If you think about that as an example, that if I was to say to you, I met a prostitute yesterday, I think most of us would have very negative thoughts about that. But if I was to then say that, and I think she's a woman of paradise, you'd probably think I've gone balmy.
When you say paradise, you mean heaven.
Heaven, paradise, heaven.
Yeah.
And we can talk about what heaven is in another sense. Yeah. Because for me, heaven is not this goal. Heaven is actually the state that we're in. Yeah. The heaven of the heart. Yes. That actually, when she did that, she attained paradise. At that moment, she attained that equilibrium of the self. And whatever happens in the afterlife, because God says, the heaven of the afterlife, don't worry about that. Like, don't count this notion of being this garden, and it's this and it's that. And these are just symbols that are just there to help you navigate through life. But don't seek the garden of the afterlife when you are missing out on the garden of this life. So I think what this example was showing was that actually you could have committed such a horrendous act the day before, and the very next day you could do something that shows your gratitude, and you've reached that state of heaven for yourself again. So I think that's just the values of Islam, unfortunately, aren't necessarily kind of seen in society in the way that I've begun to tear away much of what is packed as, okay, this is what it means to be a Muslim.
And is that problematic in terms of getting to the depth of the esoteric kind of so you've kind of described a story beautifully there that speaks about, for me it sounds like the beauty of the moment, that kind of experience of the divine, that transcendence within the moment. If you're talking to your peers, or if you're talking to your brothers at the mosque, when they hear you talk, what's their reaction? It interests me.
Initially, I'd say, I think it's over time I've learned how to express the same thing in a way that is more palatable to the individual. So because my background was teaching, we're taught to personalize the message. And I don't know what it is. I genuinely couldn't tell you what it is, but I don't get any resistance to what I say.
Okay.
Even amongst incredibly conservative or arguably extreme individuals, that when I talk to them, and I tear it down to the core, I find them always in agreement. To the point even where recently I had a conversation with a chap about homophobia. And this is a very conservative Muslim. I grew up in the same background. And I think, again, you know, if I may say, again, this is just my opinion, that I think certain renderings of religion do open up an individual to, you know, kind of be more insensitive to difference. And some of that sometimes is that it can be, an individual can become homophobic in not knowing what that world is to them. It's like, who are you? What's going on? Kind of thing. But when I explained to him that what you're doing is you're using your, like I said, look, do you want equality for Palestinians? He said, of course I do. Right? And I said, why? He said, because they deserve to have the freedom to walk the earth without, you know, fearing being killed, etc., etc. I said, okay. So tell me why the life of a Palestinian is more valuable than the life of a homosexual. Like, just tell me why. Is it by virtue of their faith? Because if that's the case, then your equality and justice is narcissistic. It's not true. It's not, you know, in terms of wholesome, because true justice is fighting for the equality in all of us. And I said that, and there's so many examples, you know, that the Prophet Muhammad, the ones that I resonate with, about how individuals, it's a cycle. And the one such expression from him was that there could be an individual who's done good their whole life, but their last moment, they've done something and they're in hell. And there could be somebody who's done bad their whole life, and the last moment they've done something and now they're in heaven. And that itself doesn't, it's not an indictment on anybody, but it's like life is this cycle. Don't think because of virtue of where I am today that I'm any better. It's like it's telling you that. Don't think you're better than anybody. That as soon as you think you're better, or that somebody's better than you, as soon as you kind of have that interplay of power, what has it essentially done? It's disconnected us from the true power, the power of the divine. Because that's the only hierarchy. And that's the message of Islam, is that there is no intermediary between the individual and God. And that's the only, it's like there's the divine and then there's the worldly self. That's it. So there's the divine and the worldly self. But when we resonate with the worldly self, that's when this hierarchy kicks in. That's when it's like, I'm better than you because actually I'm a Muslim, or I'm this, or I'm that. As opposed to, you could be of different faith, different gender, different sexual orientation, whatever it may be, we're actually equals. And to treat each other with that equality, that's the message that I'm always pushing. And I use their references that, you know, let's go back down to that Islamic faith. What does it mean? That actually there is no. So when I say to them that when you're saying somebody is less than you, then are you essentially saying that they should submit to you? You know, in terms of, you know, by virtue of their actions, are you better than them? Because
so therefore they're kind of resonating with that material plane rather than understanding that the ultimate within that material plane there is no hierarchy, there's only submission to one
definitely
God,
definitely. And I guess when I question individuals, I tend to question them without using an individual. So in the case that I just mentioned, in terms of when I do tackle homophobia amongst the communities that I interact with, and Muslim and non-Muslim, by the way. But we're talking about the Muslim community. When I do that, I tend not to use an individual from the LGBTQ community to kind of give therapy to them. Like, I don't try to humanize them. What I try to say to them is, you're dehumanizing It's a very different angle. Rather than saying, oh, look, these people, they do so much good work and they do this and do this and do this. It's like, no, hang on a second. You're the one who's wrong, who's actually seeing them as lesser than you. And you need to question that first. And the same applies to people of other faith or people of no faith.
Yeah.
That actually, when you're judging them, when you're thinking that they're less than you, there's a problem in you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you could never meet somebody from another faith, and some of your listeners may never meet a Muslim in their life. But if there's a kind of an Islamophobic viewpoint that they have, then that's an indication of a regressed type of thinking.
Yeah.
That is, I'm going to judge you and stereotype you in a certain way, and no amount of exposure to Muslims will necessarily take that root belief away. And it's going back down to that the faith of Islam, which is get rid of it all.
Yeah.
None of it. You're not better than anybody, and nor is anybody better than you. That's the starting point. Reject it all. Reject all the hierarchies. Reject all the power balances. Reject it all. And actively, and that's where justice comes in then. Because you cannot be just in fighting the cause of the Palestinians or the Syrians or anybody if you're not fighting the cause of the LGBTQ community, transgender activism. You cannot be. It just doesn't make any sense, because your message is equal. And I think many people are afraid that if I treat somebody as my equal, does that mean I lose who I am? And again, it's like, well, don't kind of project your inflated ego on a framework that is fragile. And that fragile framework, even if it's socially kind of supported, it's still fragile. Yeah. Because your truth is not defined by your religion in that sense. Yeah. It's not defined by your circle. It's defined by you. So it's taking people back to that truth.
It's interesting, yeah. The kind of the spiritual program that I work in my daily life. Yeah. There's a real danger when people apply that and they have a kind of spiritual experience, a necessary one, in order to kind of overcome addiction or kind of attachment on a kind of problematic level. There's always a danger that what happens is their own ego reconstructs from that broken state to a point where that is in fact what becomes their higher power. And it's actually in what you're saying, which is complete. Do not attach. Do not kind of get involved in that. Don't kind of become enchanted with that regrowth and we call it a kind of illusion of power, really. Where they find themselves. I've done it myself in the past, where you can start to reconstruct your ego, and then it's your ideas about what God is or what the spiritual experience that become the forefront. But those people that seem to be working it the best are people who literally clear out all of that and just live by very simple spiritual principles and don't complicate.
You can't get any more simpler than one.
The
oneness of the self. You can't get any more simpler than that. And it's when we, for me, the way that what helps me is that the realization that when I give myself importance, and giving myself importance is not absent of giving others importance. What I mean by that is learning to hear no and learning to say no. It's two very important things, because as soon as there's in terms of what is me and who I am, as soon as I see somebody more powerful than me, then some of my decision making will be surrendered to them. Right? By simple thing of you're more powerful, you'll either surrender to them passively or you'll aggressively defend yourself against it. And it's like, no, let's take those structures away. First, let's take the structures away in our mindset, and then let's take the structures away in our society, or simultaneously, however you can do that. But yeah, it's it cannot be absent of removing the inequality in society. It cannot be absent of that. And, so hence why I wanted to come here and share that there are some ideas, even within the Muslim populace, that need to be tackled from within Muslims, that need to be discussed, that are problematic, and that aren't necessarily being given the exposure that they need to, without Muslims becoming flared up and thinking that, oh my God, we're being attacked, we're the new blacks is a term. And I really despise that term. You're not the new blacks. Your Muslims are being discriminated, but it's not the new blacks. It's not by any stretch by that, because the discrimination against the black community and the anti-black racism, even within, let's just say, the South Asian community, is still there. So again, unless we tackle the inequality against all people, then it's just simply narcissistic equality that's being sought, as opposed to genuine equality.
Well, that leads me to quite. But where when I asked you to come onto this podcast, I was a little bit fearful around the subject matter. So I kind of probably unconsciously bought into a kind of idea of, oh God, I must make sure that we don't get too inflammatory, and I'll talk to Raz about it before, and I suppose that kind of raises quite a good question, really. Is there something that's kind of exclusive to Islam, which where criticism that might be afforded to other religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, where they're able to kind of roll with that and kind of answer those questions on a kind of global scale? Not always, and that hasn't always been the case, I know that. But I suppose within the 20th century we can point to the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, the Danish cartoonists, and it seems to me that what Islam may be suffering from is this kind of inability within the liberal Western world to kind of take criticism, to take parody, to take the kind of the usual standards by which liberal society will kind of critique. So how do you see that? I
think it's a very, very, very important pathway to kind of explore here. What I'd say is that there's an idea of Islam in general that is here in the West, and we've got to understand Islam has been in the West for a long time. There's even in this in the UK, I think it was Lord Headley was a Muslim in the 19th century, or maybe earlier than that. So it's been here. There's even mention of, in the 7th century, King Offa minting a coin with the declaration of faith, La ilaha illallah, on it. Now, whether it was because he was a Muslim, or whether it was because he wanted to raise the value of his coin to kind of mimic the Islamic coin, which was of value at the time, who knows? But certainly there was this kind of influence there at the time. But post World War II, when the Muslims came into the West on a larger scale, there's a space that's created since then with Muslims that has left a certain, I'd say, defensiveness, right? Because in the beginning, what I would say is that, my parents came into this country where they had, shit thrown at them, or they had people call them a Paki, and that was regular. And we were told, when you go to school, make sure that you go straight to school and you come straight back, and it's big, and that level of kind of fear was there, that we don't go into those areas, we don't go outside of these 4 or 5 streets, because these 4 or 5 streets were deemed safe because we saw people of the same color in these streets. But as soon as we went into an area on the other side, we would hear stories of people getting beaten up, and I myself, was beaten up a few times, chased, by racists at the time. So I think that leaves you now, when you've come to a new country and you're not really been welcomed. I mean, we've got to be honest about that. I don't think we were welcomed, but equally, there was also a case of, okay, so how do we now find ourselves? And it's like, let's stick to each other. That's where we're safe. There's been social experiments done where individuals go into a room. If you had a couple of men and 100 women in the room, those men will gravitate in that way. Why? Because that's what they deem to be what is familiar to them.
Yeah.
But somebody who sees beyond that will just go to anybody. So it's not kind of categorical, but it's like there's some who go beyond that. Similarly, if you got a group in a room and you've got a couple of Muslims, you'll find that some individuals will gravitate towards them because they feel safe, even though actually they might find that they're safer in somebody that they deem in that first impression as different to them. If you look around the world, if you look at the Islamic world, pre-colonialism, it's certainly in the first few centuries after the Prophet, the spirit of inquiry, the spirit of learning was huge, and you had many variations of Islam. What I mean by variations, I mean the manifestation of Islam in Morocco was different to the manifestation of Islam in China, to the manifestation of Islam in Indonesia, to the manifestation of Islam in Baghdad, or the manifestation of Islam in Medina, in Saudi Arabia. It was different, and it was all welcomed, because it was never about taking the individual away from where they are, but again, it was about bringing the truth into the equation, as opposed to bringing your version of the truth into the equation. It's like, the purpose of it was to dismantle these ideas of the self, as opposed to this is what it means to be a good Muslim. Now, having said all of that, I think here in the West, because there is a defensive mentality, I would argue, that defensiveness then hasn't helped post 9/11 when Muslims were just generalized. And it takes a lot of, psychological currency to be in a space where you can say, okay, maybe we need to think, right? If I'm in a room and I talk to Muslims and I say to them, I think we really need to think about the homophobia in our spaces. As somebody myself who in the past was homophobic, although not consciously, but was, because of the way I kind of latched onto certain ideas. But having had to unpack them, it's important for me now to kind of question Muslims and say, do we really need to think about how things are? So I think in terms of the psyche of Muslims here in the West needs a lot of growth. But the spirit of Islam is actually reformational in its essence, because it's saying to you that because if you think about it, if Islam was this categorical, step-by-step guide on how to live, like what I mean is in terms of definitive, you must grow your beard this length, and which is often referred to by individuals as though that's a measure of your Islam. The very first time somebody wrote down the words of the Prophet were many, many decades later. Some say it was 150 years later. 150 years later, somebody wrote down what the Prophet said, because it was an oral tradition. It was learning through the individual who's teaching you, your teacher. So it was what that meant was, it wasn't supposed to be defined in the sense that the essence of Islam is there, like many other faiths and religions. It was just something which, over the time, when somebody started to think, okay, right, and it happens, somebody thought, we need to document this. We need to absolutely write this down. And whether it was power play or whatever it may have been, feeling attacked and all of these kind of things, we need to actually document this just in case we lose it. And then now you've got somebody's version. It's like history is his story, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what it was. So I think that the Islamic faith does absolutely lend itself to reformation. Of course, there are some things that mainstream traditional Muslims will say, no, this is a no-go area. If you do this, you're actually not a Muslim at all, kind of thing. And I think that's more the psyche of the Muslim than the actual faith itself, is what I would say. Although individuals may not necessarily from the Muslim faith say that that is the case, I would say that is, and I'm more than inclined to kind of open the space for anybody to come and question that actually, if you look at the character of Muslims in Morocco and in southern Spain, and if you look at the character of Muslims that were in Medina and the character of Muslims that were in Baghdad, they were very, very different. In their nature, they were very, very different. Some were more liberal, some were less liberal, and that's because Islam allowed itself, and neither one of them thought we're better than you. It's just actually that's just the culture that it was there. So truth can find itself in a conservative home as well as a liberal home, and everything in between.
So and leading on from that, really, so there's almost a cognitive dissonance that I've noticed in Muslim people that I come to contact with in my social life and my friends, where on the one hand they can hold very kind of, I would say, left-leaning, socialist, liberal kind of views. They with activism, they'll actively be involved in that. And then on the other hand, if pressed on other issues, this kind of conservatism leaps out with a small c, admittedly. But
give us an example.
I suppose, I have a friend who's very pro-Palestinian. He's a kind of he would campaign for Corbyn. He'd be involved in the usual leftist kind of tropes, smashing the kind of the man, the patriarchy, the hierarchy. But then when it comes to a more kind of family, let's say, or kind of how things should be in the home, and then I suppose you get the difference between the political and the personal. I've been studying that at university recently. And some people will say that everything is political. Some people will say that there's only political forums that you interact within. But yes, so anyway, on for this individual in particular, and he will say it as well. He'll almost qualify it before it happens. He will say, I'm going to be very conservative about this, and this is my opinion. At the time, I was going through a separation. In fact, I'd had children with a woman who I hadn't married, for instance, and he was going, well, no, this is a shame, and any loving advice came from him at the same time, but it was through a lens of judgment that didn't marry itself.
So he was discouraging you from leaving. Is that what?
Yes, I would say so. I think that his opinion would have been to use my personal spiritual, my spiritual self in order to transcend the situation and use those kind of attributes in order to get through the situation.
I get you.
Which is, lovely advice. But as I say, it's through a lens of conservatism, I would say. Yeah,
it's interesting you say that, because I think I'd say that's not exclusively to Muslims. The family unit, I think, gets overly emphasized in certain spaces. And I think that there are reasons for that, because it's seen as, well, actually, if you, again, think about it, if the structure of society was built in a way that if you got divorced, that your family would still be protected within that society, right? We know that single parent households do struggle in ways that a household where parents are together don't as much, and that's almost entirely, I would say, economic. In the world that we're living in today, if you haven't got two people who are earning in a household, it's very, very difficult.
Yes, yeah.
And that has huge impacts. It's got nothing to do with the fact that there's only one parent. It's got almost everything to do with the fact that that parent doesn't have the time to spend with their kids because they're having to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs or whatever it may be. And those are many, many factors. And of course, yes, there's emotional things and what have you. But I think sometimes what happens is it's more about, if you've got your family together, then you're safe from the big boogeyman, which is society. You know, it is that element of society is pretty messed up. And if your family's together, then you'll be fine. And, you know, I still have that imprinting in my head, even though I don't consciously believe it, but still there's that, you know, in my head. And recently a friend of mine, not so recent, it was the last year, he was going through a very difficult time with his family. And he came to me for advice as well in terms of his marital situation. And, you know, I really had to catch myself from saying to him, look, you need to really think about the impact on your kids and all this kind of thing. But what I did say to him in the end was, you've got to do what's true to you. You know, like, that's what you've got to find. Is, are you running away from your truth, or are you going towards your truth? Because wherever your truth is, you'll be able to judge it yourself. Rather than me giving you the answer, then again, if I gave him a response, it's kind of still pitching myself as this, I'm better than you, you must listen to me because I'm this kind of Muslim or whatever. And people do that. Yeah. But it's just simply getting people to understand that. And I think that's just what it is. It's yes, Islam does believe in, because the family unit is important. You know, but what I would question is, what do people mean by the family unit? Because the family unit isn't just husband, wife, and children. Because in the true essence of family should stick together. You know, if a person does feel that, actually, you know what, I don't think I can stay and spend the rest of my life with this person, I can't find companionship with this person, that arguably they're brothers and sisters, and everybody should still, you know, keep the unity there. In a wonderful world, you know, if you were difficult with each other and you think, let's still raise our kids, but separated. And I think it's that. I think it's just it's that resort, that kind of, okay, look, we've got to protect, as opposed to, tackle that, but let's tackle the issue. The issue is society mistreats single parents in that sense. Let's tackle that. Society doesn't give support spaces for fathers on how can they connect with their kids when they're not living with them. Like, you know, how many spaces are there out there to do that? I mean, I myself, I didn't live with my eldest son for a long time. And I had to really navigate and find that connection with him all on my own. I didn't have anybody, no elder, no parent, no father, no uncle who could say, right, okay, what's going on? You know, how are you with him? And come on, let's kind of talk it through. Nobody did that. I had to, you know, I read and read and read and read tons of books and listened to tons of material to find that ground where I could reconnect with my son. And then when he was 16, I asked him to move in with me and take care of him and rekindle that equality in him. And you know, we're in a way, way better space, you know, from where he was taking drugs and doing all sorts of things. But we're in a space now where I'm saying to him, well, he just finished his college, and I said, look, just find yourself, man. Just go chill, relax, find work. You don't need to go to uni. That's not right now. Do it when you're ready, rather than my expectation. You've got to live up to this thing. And whereas my mom, his grandmother, is saying, oh, why isn't he going to uni? Because he's got to go uni, and then he's going to get married, and then he's going to do all of that kind of things. So just leave that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's not. And as you were saying it there, I was questioning my own thoughts in real time. I was thinking, is it particularly, is that a phenomenon amongst Muslim people, or actually are we talking about here, you know, the larger structural social economic system against, you know, the family unit, you know, across any culture? But I suppose a theme that's come across very clearly from this discussion would be that you've got, you know, you've got these kind of, it's more about immigrant communities, really, isn't it? And that protective, it's the faith is almost kind of unimportant there in that sense, in the structural sense.
It spills over to each other.
It spills over, and I'm sure it helps massively with the kind of the transcendence against adversity as well. So the personal experience of being an immigrant, and I suppose that can blur over and perhaps become more, more extreme in some circumstances, and then more, just more transcendent and more able to cope in other circumstances. I suppose it may be time to, if this is one that's rolled out kind of systematically, and I'll play devil's advocate, and I'll ask it just for the viewers to know, or the listeners to know. I do this in the interest of discussion, not of judgment. So how do Muslims reconcile the marriage of the Prophet Muhammad to Aisha, a 9-year-old minor? Now I know that is, it could be seen as just deliberately evocative, but
no, that's good. I mean, as I said to you before, that it's important that we discuss we discuss what is in society about how is it that in this regard, I don't think it's an important question. There's a few things I'd say, and again it kind of brings it down to the fact that my own belief, and it's being really questioned more and more, is actually she wasn't 9, and that idea that her being 9 has somehow got into the collective narrative of a lot of Muslims who haven't seen any evidence to suggest it except to hear it, and it's just become the norm. It's just, okay, that's what it is. And I tell you why. So for example, back in those days, 1400 odd years ago, they didn't have a calendar in that sense, in the way that we do today. Things were measured by big events. So if something happened, they would say, oh yeah, this person was born a year after that, or this person was born 2 years after that. And if you think about, the other events in the time of the Muslims, for example, the Prophet's marriage to his first wife, it's not clear what year it was. The Prophet's time in where he initially spent the first decade, and then the next decade of his life, of his prophethood, is spent in another city. Even that is questionable. Some say it's 10 years, some say it's 13 years. And these are major events. The marriage of the Prophet to Aisha was not a major event. So he wouldn't have had categorical, defining thing to say, right, okay, yeah, that's the year it absolutely happened. So, so that's the context, right? And bear in mind also the first time it was written about is 150 years later. So 150 years later, the age of Aisha and all of that is written down. Okay? So with all of that in mind, if you look at actually the life of Aisha and how in some texts she was said to actually be amongst the early Muslims who came into the faith, the early individuals came into the faith, would actually put her, according to that, as more around the 19, 20, 21 age, as opposed to the 9-year-old. Because in the spirit of Islam, there was no other practice that reflected that. The companions of the Prophet loved him so much that they would emulate him, to the point where he had 2 buttons undone from his shirt and one other companion would do exactly the same. To the point where they would dress like him, and they would act like him, and they would walk like him, and they absolutely loved him. Like today we get it.
Hero worship.
There was huge amount of kind of love and emulance of him, and yet not a single one of his companions replicated that. Not a single one of his companions married a 9-year-old girl. No scholar of Islam, main scholar of Islam or minor scholar of Islam, ever suggested that actually, or sanctioned or carried out the marriage of themselves or their followers or anyone to a 9-year-old in that way. It was never ever. It's just never happened. So that really does beg the question: did it even actually happen? And that's where I sit. Is I think that it's been pushed down, and it's. I know that you mentioned that some people use the argument that, oh well, back in those days people would marry 9-10-year-olds. But again, I'm not sure with how did people even know their age. I mean, like my grandmother, or my wife's grandmother anyway, she doesn't know her age, or she's passed away now, but she didn't know her age when she came to this country. You know, their birthdays were January the 1st. All of them. There's a lot of people. Their birthdays are January the 1st because that's what they knew.
Yeah.
Or December the 25th, or whatever it is. They all have the same birthdays. On January the 1st, a lot of Pakistani parents, that's their birthday, because that's what they wrote down. Like, many parents, they're actually a lot younger than what's on the passport, a lot older what's on the passport. It's because they just didn't know. Oh yeah, how old are you actually? I'm not really sure.
The mother of my children was, she was a refugee from Iran at the time of the revolution, and her birthday is January the 1st, and she's not even sure which year.
Wow.
So she doesn't even know how old she is. And she's more of our age.
Exactly.
Round about, she doesn't even know. Around.
So in the context of all of that, I strongly believe that it didn't happen. She was not 9. Because it was never replicated. Is a big indicator. It was never, it doesn't make sense in terms of there was nothing to show any importance to that event, to any other event that happened around that time, to say, well, that happened in that year and this happened in that same year. There was nothing like that. And as I said, whereas if you look at the Prophet's polygamy, that's clear. He married many, many wives. Yeah, it's very clear, and there's a rationale behind it, and there's a reason behind that whole thing. But this one, very unusual. He married widows. He married women in their 50s. He married women in their 60s. He married far and wide. Women of different color. He married different individuals. But that is like such an isolated thing that I think has kind of seeped into the everyday individuals.
Would you say that has been a political endeavour by certain groups in order to...
I think over time, we can't ignore the influences of certain historians in shaping how people saw things and push things, and then it's caught fire. Yeah. But it's not right.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'd like to invite you to problematise an area of Islam. So I've been kind of fervently here trying to think of questions, but then it would seem a better tack to perhaps say, is there anything? So there was a podcast that I listened to which is very, very heavy, and it was Sam Harris and a very eloquent young man, and that really got to the kind of, really, it was just a pissing contest between two intellectuals. Take away any denomination from it, and that's what it ended up as. Some of the more deep philosophical stuff that came out of that, I suppose what Sam Harris was kind of looking at was, the core of his argument was, it's perfectly rational for the young man who goes and joins ISIS to fight for the Islamic State. That is a rational thing for him to do on the basis that it will, he has been led to believe that will have a positive outcome. So there's something highly problematic about a mindset which rationalizes that killing. So we can't argue against the rationale of that individual. Now I can see quite a strong philosophical argument there, but I didn't really want to particularly use that example, but just maybe to be able to explore the wider philosophy around it. Is there anything that you can problematize, that you can see?
I mean, I think that's a perfectly good area to kind of drill down to. So I guess the question that comes to mind for me is there an element of Islam that promotes domination of society through violence? You know, is it? And I would say that it's a human issue that Islam and any other religion hasn't saved itself from. You know, and if you look at what's happening in Rohingya now with Buddhists, if you look at what's happened historically, even now in America with, you know, redneck Christians, or if you look at what's happening, it's just that's not in any shape or form to diminish what is happening, but we've got to look at it in context. The context is that, does Islam protect itself, the faith of Islam, does it protect itself entirely from individuals kind of manipulating its text and using it violently? And I would say that, as with anything, you can use anybody's words and use them to further your sadism and your kind of your toxicity. So having said that, you know, there have been historical spaces and things that have grown where, again, it's that us versus them, the end of times narrative, which has been, so there's my understanding of Islam, and then there's a collective understanding of Islam that some groups do have. That is there. So you can't deny that. You can't deny the fact that there are individuals and who think that by going abroad to go and kill somebody, that will attain you paradise, right? You can't deny that. But them wanting to go and kill is for what purpose? Because you cannot ignore the sociological and psychological impact of that action on themselves, and it's not just to attain a paradise, because that idea of paradise represents something for that person at that moment in time. And what does it represent? It represents this idea that I'm more powerful than you, that I have now got a space in heaven, and the quickest way to do it is to put a gun in my hand and to shoot you. That's what it essentially represents. But why would a person want to do that? And you cannot ignore the fact that such individuals are broken or are disempowered or are, you know, and that doesn't mean just on a certain poverty spectrum. They could be coming from any background, whether they're from a rich household or a poor household. But these are individuals who are suffering, I would say, from real mental health issues. And aren't given the space to say, shit, man, I'm feeling psychotic. And what happens is that there's certain spaces in society that such mental health does allow yourself to go and screw your own life up, right? Those spaces are there, right? In society, those spaces aren't there in the Muslim society. Because in the Muslim world, you're not allowed to drink. You're not allowed to go and drink alcohol. You're not allowed to do any of these things. So they're not self kind of defeating spaces, because it's like, if you construct society and you give people the tool to destroy themselves, when they're feeling dejected and they're feeling absent and disconnected from society, they'll use those tools, but in the end they're only destroying themselves and their family. But if you take those tools away, then that individual, what will they do? They'll actually become the tyrant. You know, and that tyrant now wants to, you throw in a few verses and you shift the meaning of them. Now you've got somebody who's inherently violent by virtue of their experiences, and now they've got a verse that talks of something and they've just manipulated it, and they've got an English translation of it, and they think, hang on, and it's like, let me take that and now let me go and kill and I'll get my paradise. And it's like I was discussing this with a few friends the other day, that this thing about the women of paradise. You must have come across this, right? The 72 Hurul Ain, the virgin women, right? And you know, my son was in the conversation too, and he was the one who actually asked the question that, you know, why is it men get 72 women and women, they apparently only get one husband, right? Like, you know, if we're all equal, what the hell's going on there? And I said, you've got to take it back down. You can't look at things literally. You've got to take it back down to the context of where we are in the world, the context of who we are, and the context of the message of Islam. And for me, anyway, what I understood is that we all came from the womb of our mother, everybody, right? Which is a feminine space. And in the world that we're living in, right, at the moment, and it's growing and it's evolving, but it was heavily patriarchal, and that patriarchy is breaking down over time. And what it essentially was, for me, what it suggested was that, first and foremost, remember, heaven is, as God says, is what no eye has seen, what no mind can imagine, and what nobody has ever heard about. So any idea of heaven you've got, it's not actually heaven. So even the women of heaven, that's actually a metaphor. And I thought, what is that a metaphor for? It's actually a metaphor to realize that if you want heaven, then embrace femininity. That's what it was for me. That actually the abundance of feminine energy that is coupled with heaven, that the heaven that you want in this world, the journey to heaven is to hold on to your masculinity and actually add upon it that femininity. So a lot of spiritual teachers, they talk about how the journey of spirituality is the feminine journey. That you cannot be, rugged and there's a space for the warrior. Don't get me wrong. I'm not one of those individuals who thinks that actually we need to just be completely just singing Kumbaya every day. And there's nothing wrong with singing Kumbaya, by the way.
Toxic masculinity and all that kind of
But toxic masculinity has become toxic because it's absent of the feminine within. And it's the reconciliation of the anima and the animus that we must kind of bring together. And for me, the 72 women of heaven was a metaphor for the huge need men have by virtue of being a man in this space that we call the world, that you must actually in abundance embrace that feminine. And hence why it's the crumbling away of but it's the rejection of that feminine that has led patriarchy to go on drugs, to go on overdrive. That the overdrive of the masculine energy has led to kind of the world to where it is in religious spaces and capitalist spaces. These endless wars that we have going on, that's toxic masculinity. That's the spectrum that it sits on. And it's very interesting. It reminds me of a documentary I watched once about how they train American soldiers, and this one US general said, we kill the woman in the man to make him a killer.
The anima.
Right? We kill the woman in the man. And however, if we embrace the anima within, we're not going to get killing. We're going to get balance. And that's why I always, I push this notion of, the root of where we came was feminine. We navigate through life, the worldly life, with the masculine, but we return to the spiritual life with the feminine. And we must never associate the masculine and the feminine with just males and females. And that's why for me, I have no issue with if a person wants to identify themselves as whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just whatever your balance of masculine and feminine is. It's got no issue there.
So we're talking about the kind of the archetypal feminine and masculine, really, aren't we? And I suppose, it's that, that kind of that I know it's associating the feminine with chaos, but not in the way as that sounds. I think sometimes I find, because I have very similar beliefs, and I speak to people about it. And it's lovely to be able to talk to you about it, but quite often people, they can take things at far too face of value, and they're willing to look at the kind of the deeper esoteric kind of archetypal thing. But that walking the line between chaos and authority, chaos being abundance, birth, something out of nothing, magic, really, which is the feminine, and that balance between the two things. I think it's for me, it's quite remarkable, and I don't know why I'm able to talk to a Muslim man about this. You know? And I don't know why that should be the case. Okay, so I think we'll kind of move towards the end of this with trying to get to the essence of the essential message of Islam and what that might offer the Western world. But just before that, actually, do you actually believe that Islam can exist, coexist, or be of benefit to a liberal democratic world?
Yeah.
I mean, whether or not we remain in a liberal democratic world for much longer is a bigger question, and certainly with the rise of populism and the kind of move towards identity politics and the kind of place where we are now, who's to say whether or not neoliberalism or liberal democracy will remain the kind of homogenous ideology? But should it remain that way, is there a place for Islam in that? What can Islam teach us?
I mean, it's difficult to respond to that so broadly. What I can certainly say is that in terms of me as a Muslim and what the Islam I subscribe to, I think that there's a recognition that in the space that we're in the world today, there is a huge drive and thrust towards individualism, and individualism that's kind of really circumvented the vertical transference of tradition. You know, the vertical transference of goodness and truth. And what's happened is, because it's all about me, and it's not necessarily about wider society and all of that kind of thing. It's kind of pitched now these two little extremes, and I think I see them as both the same. Whether it's the conservative and the hardcore liberal, they kind of just they're shadows of the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's about what, for me, the Islam I subscribe to, and I have Buddhist teachers. One of my first mentors in my 20s was a Buddhist man who, I owe much of my thinking to, and I've learnt from others too, from the Christian faith, from the Islamic faith, and from, in fact, even individuals. There was a point when I listened to a lot of Sam Harris and a lot of Christopher Hitchens, because I thought, if I can listen to them, then it will challenge my ideas, and whatever remains after that, I know is my truth, right? That I should be able to kind of, in this space, hear what's being said and actually remain as it is. And so that, I guess it's kind of realizing that there's a space for us to create a sense of respect for each other. That the reason why identity politics is growing is because people are feeling absent of what society is. And it's like, well, let's blame the bankers, let's blame the politicians, let's blame the boogeyman Muslim, let's blame all of these people for why society is crumbling, and what nobody's doing is looking at what they are doing themselves. So if anything Islam can offer, or what I tend to give people, is just be a mirror to each other. And being able to be a mirror means that we're not here to save anybody, but what we're here to do is give these gifts of our own truth, and if they accept it, they accept it, and if they're not, they're not. In this heavily driven individualistic world, it's all about getting your likes and your shares and your views, and it's like, well, maybe it's time we just give and ignore the likes and the shares and just give. I'm not saying that you shouldn't learn how to influence in that space, don't get me wrong, but we shouldn't be defined by it. Because so many people do stupid things just to get their shares and their likes high. And what does that show? It's I was with one of my friends. His sister was struggling with her. She's a divorcee mom, and she was struggling with her son. And he just said, "Can you talk to him?" And I said, "I rarely do. I tend to talk to the parents, because I think that you're the one who really needs to be empowered and understood. That are you seeing yourself in the equation? But on this occasion, I will. What was interesting, so this young man has got something like 80,000 followers on Instagram or something. And he said, I don't need my mom. I don't need her at all. I've got my followers. So he'll put up a video and they'll all like his video and he'll think he's amazing. And what was interesting is I said, okay, I said, I realized that I'm not going to be able to really impact anything with this kid. So I just kept it sweet, ended the conversation. And a few weeks later, he got caught up in some trouble with the police. And nobody came to his rescue from these Instagrammers or whatever. Nobody did. Who came in the end? It was his mom.
Yeah.
And it's that realization that actually, how can we give ourselves back to ourselves? In a world that says you're happy if you're married, you're happy if you go on your holidays, and you're happy if you do all of the. That's what happiness is. It's like, no, it's not about happiness. It's actually about truth. Whatever it is, it's about the journey to truth, and the journey to truth is riddled with ugliness, because you've got to peel that bullshit away, and that's that beginning point of. Over the years, we've accumulated a lot of bullshit that we need to reject. So it's the la ilaha, reject it. Reject everything that we've become submissive to, and accept the oneness of the self. Illah, accept that, and embrace the oneness of the self in whatever space that we're in. That's what I'd say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Razwan. I can't think of a better place to end than that. And thank you so much
for coming down.
Thank you so much
for having me
and sharing your thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.